I'm re-recording the video on my races for my setting because I've decided to make some changes and update my setting manual with regards specifically to the races. So let's get right to it. I'll try to do this one a lot faster than the other one. I've got a number of races. It's a very, I don't want to say it's necessarily a traditional fantasy, but it's not a crazy one. It doesn't have all kinds of weird animal people and other weird things. But it also doesn't have elves and dwarves and halflings and stuff like that. It's kind of got a different spread of races, if you will. The first one, the most obvious one, of course, is humans. I've never yet seen a fantasy setting that doesn't feature a lot of humans, and I can't imagine being super excited about one that doesn't. I've kind of come around over the years to seeing the wisdom that Gary Gygax had of preferring very humanocentric settings, much like most of the literature, the sword and sorcery stuff in particular, did. And there's not a ton of different cultures of humans in my setting because it's meant to represent a geographically constrained area. So it's much like the size of Europe, perhaps. The protagonist race of humans are the hillmen from the hill country. They are much like what you'd expect from typical fantasy, kind of Robin Hood era Englishmen, combined with a fair dose of the American frontier. So technologically, they would be like Middle Ages English, but from a cultural and societal standpoint, there's an awful lot of the American frontier mixed in as well. There are other races of humans. The other major nation of humans would be Timishburg. There's two races there, the Timishers, who are kind of like medieval Saxons or Austrians as an overcast, if you will, ruling an area where there's an undercast or underclass of Tarusians, which may be sort of like the Romanians or the Hungarians. This is meant to kind of give a Transylvania feel, where there's it's supposed to be a country that's very much like a fantasy version of Bram Stoker's Transylvania, but again, more with a medieval level fantasy rather than the 1800s. And then the third race of humans is the Drylanders. I consider them much like the more barbaric Slavs, the Cossacks kind of in particular. There are some that live urban lives and live in urban centers, but many of them are more nomadic and belong to tribes still and just kind of wander around with their horses and stuff. And that's there's a few other races here and there, but those are the basic human races. I also like to call many of my other races humans, though, but that's not entirely true because they have been changed by something, either a supernatural event or a supernatural admixture into their bloodline or a curse or something that happened to them. And so they're humans, but they're different than any other humans, and their racial traits are also different than humans. And I'm not going to talk about the racial traits because I'm not going to talk about system. The first one of these are the Grizzlings. The word gris is an Old English word related to grizzly and grizzled. As you can imagine, the Grizzlings are completely gray. They're also called the Hyperboreans sometimes because originally they came from Hyperborea, but Hyperborea is no longer habitable and they no longer live there. So Grizzlings now are mostly known from Lomar, which is a city-state up kind of to the north of the hill country. Like I said, they're very gray. That is kind of their whole appearance is based on their grayness. They're pale gray, fading almost to white, but it's not like albino. There's no pinkness to them. It's more like a very chalky kind of white gray. Their hair is white. Their eyes are white. They're like silver chrome, and they often speak with kind of a rasping whisper. They have kind of a dark history. Hyperborea was destroyed by one of the arch sorcerers of the setting, who luckily has not been seen in generations. Nobody knows what happened to her, but they've had to flee Hyperborea. It kind of, an ice age caught up to it almost, overnight. And they now live, like I said, in Lomar. There's two populations there that originally fled from two different city-states in Hyperborea. One of them is very friendly with the hillmen, and they've even borrowed a lot of their culture and other things. The other is very traditional and kind of barbaric, and there's a lot of tension between the two. But grizzlings can be found throughout most of the setting, although they're most common, of course, in Lomar. Many of them travel, many of them are merchants or adventurers or whatever else they may be, and you can find them in lots of other places as well. If the grizzlings are characterized by their pale grayness, the chemlings, on the other hand, are characterized by their very dark grayness or even jet blackness. They tend to have black skin like obsidian or coal or charcoal. Sometimes it is very dark gray, but as often as not, it's literally just quite black. Their hair is dark as well. Their eyes are glowing yellow. Their ancestry, they claim, was from a demon prince eventually, and they are said to resemble him. Occasionally one is born with odd demonic features like a forked tongue or a long thin tail, or the most common one is a ring of horns around their head like a crown, kind of like Darth Maul, but shaped more like a crown. And this doesn't happen to most of them. Most of them just look like jet black humans with glowing yellow eyes. They are mostly from Baal Hamazi. They're also called the Hamazin, but that's more of a political designation rather than a racial one. And there are humans, regular humans, who are also Hamazin, who are from Hamazi, Baal Hamazi. Their nation kind of fell apart, and many of them have spread out in kind of a diaspora of trying to flee the chaos in Baal Hamazi. So they can be found pretty much everywhere as well. The next set of races are from Kurushat, which is another nation also to the north. Up near Baal Hamazi, they used to actually be rivals with each other, whereas Baal Hamazi kind of just fell apart due to internal problems and turned into just a chaotic mass of a handful of city-states and nomadic tribes. Kurushat was from the north, and their imperial presence kind of retreated. And so there are some who are left here, but they don't have any financial, economic, social, or political backing from their home country anymore. So they're kind of like the Crusader states, I would guess, where there's relatively small numbers of them kind of surrounded by just regular people, drylanders for the most part. And they have these smaller city-states up in the north that are kind of independent and kind of trying to find their own way. A lot of them are kind of plagued by some melancholy because they see the dissolution of their political fortunes, but others, on the other hand, look, with some, they like the idea that they're independent and they can kind of go do what they want. The Kurushati look like humans when they're young, although kind of exotic. They have pale gray eyes, but kind of darker skin, sharp cheekbones, and they look like this up until about puberty, when they all manifest some type of elemental power, and all of them have some kind of curse, or maybe it's not a curse, maybe it's a blessing. It depends on who you talk to, but they all have this elemental matrix in their genetics. And they all, at puberty, will have some minor little power, like some of them can, control fire a little bit to a minor degree. Some of them can control lightning. All of them are connected in one way or another to one of the four elements. And so there's four different sub-races of the Kurushati elementalists. There's the Surters, which are very fire-like. They're very red-skinned, blonde hair, fiery yellow eyes. They can, their special ability is once a day they can make their weapon fiery and attack with extra fire. There's the Sylphs, who are air elemental tied. They usually have blue or gray skin and blue or white hair and silvery eyes. very tall and thin usually, and they like the cold. They're kind of, all of them are from the north, but the sylphs in particular like the cold and they're most comfortable with it. They once a day can kind of do the same thing, but with lightning. The tritons are next. They're tied to the water element. They are more teal colored. They do not have the ability to, make their weapon watery or attack with extra water damage, but they can breathe underwater as well as they can breathe in the air, so they're perfectly at home in the water. And then the last one, of course, are the dvergs, which are earth elemental-like. They tend to have kind of metallic colored skin, looks like iron gray. It's not shiny like metal, but it looks like iron. It's like iron gray or kind of brassy or coppery. And they have eyes that kind of shine in a kind of an orange way, like molten steel or molten magma. And they are just much tougher than the others. They have a +1 to con and a +1 to armor class. So those are the elementalists. The last two races that are part of the default races are the only two who are not human at all, and they are completely inhuman, although compared to their counterparts in many other fantasy settings, they will seem much more human-like than they might in some other settings. And those are the orclings. They come in two forms, orcs and goblins. Orcs are bigger, stronger. Goblins are small, short, kind of thin and wiry. Orcs, of course, they're both green-skinned. They don't have, the exaggerated tusks or teeth, and they don't have exaggerated cartoonish features and look like, green hairless gorillas like a Warhammer or Warcraft orc does or something like that. They look much more like people, but they're not. They are the only race, in fact, that is not human and never was human. They were just very human-like. The orclings come from the south, kind of off from a country called Gunacht, which is out of the scope of the setting development. It's to the south. Many of them are migrating north because of problems in Gunacht. They're not necessarily always the best neighbors because they tend to be very impulsive and sometimes kind of violent. They're not evil or bad like orcs are in some other settings, but I'm not going out of my way to sugarcoat the fact that they're not nice neighbors. You don't want them really in your territory. Most of them are just passing through the hill country on their way to Chersky Island, where they've been able to negotiate a territory for them to kind of set up their own little colony. It's an island in the middle of the Darkling Sea. Nobody else was using it. Nobody was living on it except for a handful of hermits, and everybody, all of the other nations in the area kind of agreed that, why don't you guys go there and leave the rest of us alone. But that said, many of them will be seen throughout the three realms, either passing through, or some of them have stopped and settled and they're, working. In some cases, they're valued or at least tolerated because of their strength, so that they can do different types of manual labor, work on farms, work in mines, stuff like that. So those are the main races. I also have a handful of races in the appendix. One of them is, before I start talking about them, let me explain why they're in the appendix. For the most part, these are much rarer races. Two of them, in fact, do not have any society of their own. They just appear kind of singly, and you'll see why when I explain. One of those is the Dhampir. These are people who have been attacked by vampires, but for whatever reason were not actually turned into vampires entirely and were able to kind of escape. But they're partially turned, and they tend to be very pale and look like they've been all bleached out of all color. Their hair is kind of a pale, wheat-like blonde or even white. Their skin is very pale. Their eyes usually red. Not a lot of people necessarily believe in the existence of Dhampirs. They're that rare, but usually when they do, they kind of try to hide who they are and what's happened to them. The next race that's also similar to this are the Seraphs. These, if the Kemlings are supposed to be the descendants of a demon lord mixed with humans, the Seraphs claim to be descendants of some kind of angel. However, if an angel had descendants with mortals, then it was by default, by definition in fact, a fallen angel. And nobody really knows if this is true. Seraphs just kind of appear here and there. There's no community of Seraphs. They don't have, their own bloodline where, everybody's born a Seraph. They kind of just pop up on occasion as the descendant of somebody who probably didn't know that they had the ability to have a Seraph child. They tend to also have silver or gold hair, golden eyes. They look very beautiful. They look angelic. They do sometimes tend to be kind of sociopathic, which maybe it's something about the circumstances of their life and how they grow up. But maybe it's because if they do have an angelic ancestor, it's because it was a fallen evil angel. And then the last race are the wood roses. You could use these. They're much more rare, and they don't have quite as much a place in the setting. They don't wander as much. They usually live deep in the woods where they kind of avoid people. There are some of them that live in the cities where they are kind of thugs quite frequently, and they have a reputation for being muscle for the mafia. But those of them who do live amongst regular people kind of really work very hard to rehabilitate that reputation and try to prove that they're, worthwhile members of the community who should be, valued and welcomed. And it's sometimes kind of hard for them because their ancestor long ago was a werewolf, and although none of them are true werewolves anymore, you can kind of see a little bit of that ancestry in them still. They tend to be pretty hairy. They tend to be kind of savage looking. They tend to have sharp teeth and sharp nails, and they're very comfortable outside. They're the most wildernessy of all the races. Another race that I actually dropped because I could not for the life of me figure out how it would make a lot of sense for them to be a player character are the Wendaks or the Grendlings, who are the descendants of Atlanteans who are devolving because of the curse of sunken Atlantis gradually into ape men. Most of them are unable to carry metal with them. All of them are unable to carry metal. If they have metal on them, they will gradually sicken and die. And I don't mean gradual as in over years, I mean over a course of weeks. So they have an obligatory Stone Age civilization. Some of them are more devolved than others and are literally almost turning into man-apes before our eyes, whereas others still kind of have a relatively highly cultured Neolithic-like settlement. All of them, however, are extremely xenophobic. They don't like anybody else. They don't like anybody else traveling through their lands. I just couldn't figure out a way to make them fit. So I decided to cut them as a playable race, although in some very unusual campaign, maybe there would be a place for them, and mechanically, of course, you could be one, but I just don't understand how I could do it in a normal campaign, so I decided to not even make them available. And there we go. Those are all the races of Dark Fantasy X.